versus the non-engineered. The same thing with frogs, other invertebrates that have to have lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. Going to some areas, you used to hear frogs all the time. Now it's really a rarity where the glyphosate's used very heavily. There's a direct toxicity to glyphosate. These are some scientific peer-reviewed studies, and the levels that they have found are toxic to various parts of our system. Human toxicity, and you can see 0.5, 1, 2, maybe 10 parts per million for total cell death, and some references there. But then you see the levels that EPA says are safe. The reason why they say they're safe is because we can't market our commodities unless the tolerance level is above what we're finding in the crop. So in May of last year, companies came to the EPA and FDA and said, we have to raise the tolerance levels so we can have, quote unquote, safe food. These are the levels that they raised it to. Some of them are doubled, some of them not quite a full doubling of the concentration that was permitted 3 years before. All of them are well above what you see in those levels. And then as you look at these levels and you say, well, why is glyphosate twice as toxic in canola oil as it is in soybean oil? Because you can have twice as much in soybean oil as you can in canola oil. And you can look at the others and say, well, where's the science that would show differences in toxicity? There's no science to back it up or to support it. In fact, the EPA and FDA both, in approving the higher levels, said we don't do any independent testing. We rely solely on the statement of the companies that these levels are safe. Now, if I was selling a product, I may want to fudge a little bit. I hope I wouldn't. But it certainly happens in our system. And you say, well, are the Europeans just having a chemophobia type of a relationship when they say we don't want GMO crops? With the new requirement or the new trade agreement with Europe, it gave them individual nation states an opportunity to opt out of accepting GMO crops. You now have over half of the countries that have opted out, including Germany, which was a surprise because they were the rapporteur state that said it's okay.
But don't they allow GMO feed for their animals?
What?
Doesn't Germany allow GMO feed for their animals?
They have one or two variety or hybrids of corn that they have permitted growing. But when it came to the opt-out now, they have selected to opt out.
Yeah.
And so you look at the differences. If you analyze urine, that's a pretty good indicator of how much you're consuming or what's going through the system. We were told initially by Monsanto that it doesn't accumulate in the body. It all passes out of the body. This is some data that Moms Across America conducted in a survey because it wasn't available. But you can see in Europe it's 0.16 part per billion. In the US it's 18.8. You see a tremendous difference when you have the genetically engineered plants and you're dumping the material directly on that food. Very different than when you have just a chance encounter from drift or from a broadcast application. And then you look at the amount that's in the breast milk. How's that baby going to develop that healthy microbiome that it has to have for resistance to produce the glutathione, the cysteine? How's it ever going to develop it with that kind of level in the breast milk? You have it in the infant formulas, so that we compromise our children almost from day one. And then you see the difference in our drinking water, 0.7 versus 700. Ib Pedersen is a hog producer in Denmark, produces 20% of all the hogs that are marketed to Europe. He's kept track of the amount of glyphosate that's in his feed now for about 10 years, and he can tell you what that percentage is, or what that level of glyphosate is relative to all of the different birth defects that occur, whether it's muscular, spinal, neurological, structural, and at levels that change 0.028 part per billion. He sees a 5% increase in the general defects, at 0.48, a 5% increase in miscarriage. And then we look at the epidemiological patterns and look at what's happening. And you have to say what's changed. This is celiac in children requiring hospitalization in Alberta, Canada. Plotted against, correlated with the amount of GMO canola and glyphosate applied, and the exposure level to those children. And you see that curve, you see the increase in the disease, and that curve that's actually fits 32 diseases that we now refer to as modern diseases, cancer being one of them. The World Health Organization just classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen and as a known animal carcinogen. The reason why it was categorized in 2A rather than 1 was because they said we don't have enough studies. We know from Hodgkin's leukemia, non-lymphatic leukemia, that there are good studies that it's a carcinogen. But when you look at the other studies, there's too much background with the limited studies that we have to really be sure on that classification, so they put it as a 2A. The state of California recently classified glyphosate as a human carcinogen. They said, we're convinced there's enough data. Dr. Anthony Samsel, through a subpoena, has been able to obtain the documentation from Monsanto. His comment is that in their 1981 and 1988 study that has never been released to the public, clearly shows that glyphosate is a direct carcinogen. There's no probability to it in his statements. And if you look at the National Cancer Institute's annual reports, you see all of those cancers that are increasing in intensity and frequency. You'll see that they're all target areas for glyphosate. The Seralini study was criticized, probably the most peer-reviewed study that's ever been submitted for publication, very intensively reviewed before that publication in chemical toxicity. It's a 2-year study on rats, the only full lifetime study that's ever been conducted of both, or of either the GMO toxicity itself or the glyphosate at 1/10 of a part per billion in the drinking water, and they had some other treatments in there too, or with the corn, GMO corn that had been treated with glyphosate. So they had 3 essential different systems there besides the control with the isogenic non-GMO feed. What they found within 4 to 6 months, all 3 of those GMO or glyphosate treated mice started throwing breast tumors, liver problems, kidney problems, and other toxicological manifestations. Didn't matter whether it was the process of GMO alone, or whether it was the glyphosate alone, or the two together. They got a similar response. It was criticized because Monsanto said, well, how can you have a chemical and a genetic engineered plant doing the same thing? Sheaver Dairy answered that question. When you're producing and see an accumulation of formaldehyde, a known carcinogen, you're going to get the same response. And that's what he's shown. You see premature death, premature aging. You look at the data from Argentina, from the drift, from the Roundup Ready fields, from aerial application across into the villages. They see the same thing and have recorded it now for 4 years happening to their children. But that epidemiological pattern that you saw with the celiac, you can see with all of these other diseases, all of the GI tract diseases fit that epidemiological pattern, many of the others. What happens in your brain is conditioned by what happens in your gut. So autism, diabetes, a lot of your other neurological conditions. And then you can go down the line, and as Dr. Nancy Swanson and Andrew Liu have taken the CDC data for the incidence of disease, and then they've tied that or correlated it with the USDA data for the GMO crop and glyphosate exposure. And you see that 0.99 to 0.98 Pearson correlation coefficient. I served on our global epidemiology working group for over 8 years for the Surgeon General. This was Australia, United Kingdom, and Canada and the US. And we'd see a curve that would start showing up for any disease worldwide. We would ask the question, is it just correlation or is it causation? If it's correlation, what's the cause? It's never been done for these diseases. For autism, we say, well, we know there's a correlation with vaccinations, with the aluminum. Dr. Stephanie Seneff spent a lot of time connecting the dots and looking at that. But she also finds that glyphosate is predominant and interacts and interfaces with the aluminum, with some of the other adjuvants that are used in vaccines. So you can have other factors, but glyphosate is a base factor in the epidemiological pattern for all of those diseases. I consulted in Guatemala on sugar cane, bananas, coffee, a few other crops down there, giving me a break from corn, wheat, barley, and soybeans and potatoes, and some of the crops I worked on for 55 years here. We're trying to move glyphosate out of their production systems in Guatemala. Been fairly successful with sugar cane, removing it as a ripener. Came up with an alternative. Brazil did the same thing. So we use a nutrient, boron. You can get the desiccation. You don't have the damage to the subsequent crops because you have a high requirement in that regrowth of the raccoon crop then to use that boron.